Well, good morning, Life Church. So glad you guys made it this morning. I hope you enjoyed some donuts. And most of you don't know about the donuts, evidently. Stay where you are. Don't rush out of here. But they are in the lobby. Krispy Kreme on the way out. Grab some. If you're watching online, you're missing donuts. So we're glad you're watching online. We're glad you're gathered here today. When you go to a 3D movie, you put on glasses that change really how you see. And sometimes that happens in life. Sometimes in life, certain things happen to us a certain way, and it changes how we see. We might have an experience, and it could be a painful experience. And now you don't see a certain person or a certain thing the same because of what you've been through. It could be something that's not painful. It could be a positive experience. Maybe you're wanting to buy a certain vehicle. You're wanting to buy a car or a certain truck. And now everywhere you drive, you see it, right, all around you. Because your experience now has changed how you see. It could be an accident. When I was a little kid, I went to my grandma's house, and she had a refrigerator. Opened it up, and I saw some chocolate in there. I go, man, this looks really good, right? And I ate like almost all of it. I said, Grandma, those Hershey's chocolate was, that tasted kind of different. She said, honey, that's X-Lax, right? I've never looked at a Hershey bar the same since. I'm telling you, how you see can be impacted by your experiences, and the scales fall off your eyes. You see things differently. We've been in this series called Paradox, and we conclude our series today. We've been talking about how some things seem contradictory, but really they're true. And Jesus Christ gave us some paradoxes, and basically this series is a teaching that Jesus gave, a series of teachings couched between two healing miracles of healing blind men. He healed a blind man in Bethsaida and helped him with sight, and now today we're going to talk about the healing of blind Bartimaeus. And in between these two healing miracles of sight, we talked about how Jesus kind of helped us see. Just as he can heal physical sight, he can also heal spiritual sight. And now in these paradoxes, he's helping us to see that death can become life. As we die to ourselves, we can really live life fully. As we go through suffering, as difficult as it is, we can experience a type of glory through that. Dependency on God results in power in life. Service to God and others is a way of greatness. Two people in a marriage can become one. Whatever you lose for the kingdom, you actually gain. And the last becomes first. These are the kind of paradoxes of life. And we're praying that God would open our eyes to spiritually see what Jesus is telling us. And today we began this series, or in this series, the way we began it, we talk about a healing of a blind person, the blind Bartimaeus. And we talk about the paradox that blindness becomes sight. The blindness becomes sight. It is possible for God to work in us as we admit that we're spiritually blind, and we admit that to Him in mercy, asking for mercy, that He can actually give us eyes to see. We saw this earlier in our series in Mark 8, verse 17. Jesus says, do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts still hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? It's possible to have physical eyes and not see. And so we're asking God to open our eyes and help us see. So I ask you today, how is your vision? Do you see? Do you see clearly? Is it blurry? Are you blinded? I'm not talking about your physical vision. I'm talking about your spiritual vision. What area in your life do you feel like you're kind of blinded and you need to see better? What area is that for you today? And I'm glad you're here. I hope you see some area where you need to change. I think changing how we see and how we live life, how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we see our world, how we see God, is part of living a bold life in Jesus Christ. It's part of being a disciple of Christ. And so I hope God will open your eyes in some area. If you're ready for a change in some area of your life, then I'm glad you're here today. We're going to talk about opening our eyes for change. And so we pick up where we left off last week with Pastor Keith, and we pick up in verse 46 of Mark 10. In Mark 10:46 it says, "Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples together with a large crowd were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging." And so you have some things happening here. You have Jericho, you have Jesus, you have disciples, you have a crowd, you have Bartimaeus, you have different things happening. Matthew in his account tells us there are two blind men, not just one, but Bartimaeus is the one who gets the attention. And they are going into, it says, Jericho. Now, they had been in Perea. You see the map on the screen behind me. They've been in Perea. They've been basically on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and Jesus had to get out of Judea because of all the hostility, and things start to turn against him. Has a little reprieve in Perea, does some teaching there, and he's there for a bit. But now they cross over the Jordan River, and they go now into the land of Israel, and the first really city of note they get to is Jericho, just 5 miles west of the Jordan River and 10 miles north of the Dead Sea. And so they're there, and Mark says they're going into Jericho, and Luke says that they are going into Jericho. Matthew says they're leaving Jericho. It's a little confusing, but there are actually two Jerichos, which makes some sense. The old Jericho, you might know in the Old Testament, they marched around it, the walls fell down, and it never had been fully restored, but there's a new Jericho that had been built, and Herod the Great had built a great palace there, and so he's probably leaving one and going to the other, and he's ministering in that vicinity there, and he's going in and out, and so he's in the area of Jericho, and next time we meet, we're going to see he'll actually make it over to Jerusalem finally. And so he will stay in Jerusalem the rest of our time together as we walk through Mark, and that is where he will actually meet the cross. But he is still here at this point in Jericho. This is the last event of his life before he goes into Jerusalem, the last healing miracle we will see in detail in the Gospel of Mark. There will be another healings that take place when he gets to Jerusalem, but they're not really specified. This is the last story that's told in any kind of detail. Jesus has been healing people throughout his 3 years of ministry, and he has exercised basically power over demons and disease and death and dangerous nature, and now he is going into Jericho and going there and in the city. Now he's leaving the city, it says here, and we go back to Mark 10:46. It says they came to Jericho, and as they were in a large crowd, they were leaving the city now, and a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. And so this large crowd is there because it's the Passover time in Israel, and so people are traveling from all around going to Jerusalem for Passover. It was something they did every single year, and so Jericho was a favorite stopping place. It was a very nice rebuilt city, and so people would often stop there, and so the parades would go through, the pilgrim processions would go through Jericho. So there's a large crowd there already. So you have these pilgrims going to Passover to Jerusalem, but you also have people following Jesus because he has healed so many people, and so you have this kind of a group of people following him as well. So you have people following Jesus, you have pilgrims, there's a large crowd, a combination of people who are there, and you have blind Bartimaeus thrown in the mix. Bartimaeus is an Aramaic name, and it actually means son of honor. Son of honor, but he didn't feel very honored because he was blind and he couldn't see, and him and his other blind friend are there, and they're calling out, and no one else, by the way, names him. Matthew does not name him. Luke does not name him in his account. Only Mark names him Bartimaeus. And many believe it is because Bartimaeus, tradition tells us, became a leader actually in the early church. He's going to be healed, follow Jesus to Jerusalem. He'll be there for the cross, be there for the resurrection, be there for the day of Pentecost when the church is born, and he'll become a leader in that church. So Mark and the Roman readers who are reading the Gospel of Mark, as Mark's writing to them, would somehow know who Bartimaeus was, probably, and so Mark drops his name in there to say, hey, this is where Bartimaeus came from. And so he's there by the side of the road. He's begging, and he's begging because that's what you did in that day and time. If you didn't have family, there was no welfare system. And so if you could not see, you could not work. And so he was basically having to live on the generosity of other people. He does what any beggar would do. You position yourself around large crowds, hoping to somehow get someone to give you some alms. And so as the pilgrim processions are going by, surely these religious people will help him out. And so he is there begging for alms. He wasn't well respected because in that day and time, to be blind was seen as a curse. And so you might remember in John where this man is blind and Jesus asked the question, who sinned, his parents or him, that he was born blind? And this idea that if you were born blind, somehow it was a curse from God. And so you had sinners, you had unclean people, and you had the curse below that. He is the lowest of the low, and he is there on the side of the road, and he is begging. And we call him blind Bartimaeus. He is basically defined by his condition, and maybe that's you today. Maybe you are defined by the condition you find yourself in. And I hope you can break free from that today, because blind Bartimaeus is going to break free from the condition that has blinded him for so long. Verse 47, it says, when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And so there's a buzz in the crowd, and the procession is going by, and blind Bartimaeus is begging for alms, and there's a buzz, and it's not the normal Passover chatter that he's used to hearing. There's more to it. We know that because in Luke's account, Luke tells us that he asked, what's going on? What's happening? He knew something more was happening, and they say, Jesus is passing by. And so he begins, when he heard that he was passing by, he begins to shout, it says here. Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua, right? Which means Joshua. It was the Lord saves. Jesus was a common name in that day and time. It's a special name to us. It's very common back then. There were a lot of Jesuses running around Israel in that day and time. So you had to qualify it. Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth, he says, have mercy on me. And he knew something about Jesus. He knew that he had heard somehow, and we just talked about the other healing miracle, the blind man in Bethsaida. He had heard about the fact this man Jesus had healed blind people. In fact, of the basic 26 recorded healings of Jesus, and he healed all kinds of people who were lepers, who were mute, who were deaf and dumb, people. He resurrected people from the dead. He exorcised demons out of all of these significant healing moments and events. A significant portion, in fact, 1 in 5 of them were the blind receiving sight. Probably one of the highest percentage of miracles, healing miracles, was blind people seeing. And he had heard about this, and so here he is. He's on the side of the road. He's begging for alms. He hears commotion. He knows it's Jesus. He's heard Jesus Christ has healed blind people, so now it's his moment. Now it's his chance. Jesus, Son of David, right? Have mercy on me. And he is shouting. The word for shout is a word that means to shriek, right? The top of your lungs. It's used in the New Testament. People are possessed by demons, the noise they make, just the loud volume. It's used of women who are giving birth, right? Women, you know the pain of birth, right? Just the anguish and the pain, right? It's used of women wailing in childbirth. He's just yelling, have mercy on me, right? Trying to be heard over the din of the mob, living a bold life, calling out boldly, have mercy on me. And he says, not just Jesus of Nazareth, but Jesus, Son of David. The first time this phrase has come up here in the Gospel of Mark. And that was a catchphrase. People knew what that word meant. It was a title for the Messiah. Has deep Old Testament roots. One of David's sons, and of course, the immediate fulfillment of the prophecy was his son Solomon, but the long-term ultimate fulfillment of the prophecy would be the Messiah who would come. And everyone talked about Son of David, how it would be the Messiah. Other than Peter and Mark, no one else has called Jesus Christ or Messiah until now. This blind man calling out Messiah. Messiah. And Jesus does not rebuke him, does not tell him to be quiet. If you've been with us in the series, you know that the messianic secret, right? He would tell people, don't tell anyone who I am. For 3 years, that's been basically his MO. Do not tell anyone who I am. Because he didn't want the word to get out too soon because people had misinformed ideas of who the Messiah was. But now he knows he only has about a week to live. And now it's time to tell. And Bartimaeus is the first person who says it who's not silenced by Jesus. He accepts the title. Son of David. Son of David, have mercy on me. See, Bartimaeus knew something, that was Jesus has healed, but he also knew something else, and that is that Messiah, when he comes, Messiah would be a healer of blindness. In the Old Testament, there are all kinds of healing miracles. Lepers are healed. There's even resurrections in the Old Testament. But not a single time in the Old Testament does a blind person receive sight. That was the purview only for the Messiah. In fact, Isaiah the prophet prophesied the day the Messiah would come. Isaiah 29:18, in that day, out of gloom and darkness, the eyes of the blind will see. And Isaiah would prophesy again in another place that when the Messiah comes, people will be able to see. And Jesus and Bartimaeus knew this. When John the Baptist was in prison, he had heard rumors about Jesus as he's in prison. And he wondered, is this really the Messiah? And in Matthew 11:2, it says, when John was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, are you the one? Are you the one who is to come? Are you the Messiah? Go ask him, is he the Messiah? He's doing deeds that only Messiah can do. And in verse 4, it says, Jesus replied, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight. The very first thing he said was, here's the proof I am Messiah. In the words of Isaiah, when I come, the blind will receive sight. Indisputable messianic identity. He's laying it out before them. Bartimaeus puts it all together. This guy has been healing people who are blind. Messiah is supposed to heal people who are blind. This guy must be the Messiah, son of David. And ironically, people who have physical vision were blind spiritually to who Jesus was, stubbornly resisting who he was. But here is a blind man who has no physical vision, but who spiritually can see who Jesus is. And he cries out for mercy. Have mercy on me. Mercy is getting what you don't deserve. He wasn't entitled. He didn't think, you owe me, God. He said, you don't owe me anything. He says, but have mercy on me. It's his last chance. It's his last chance to somehow be able to see. And this morning I kind of broken the message up into kind of an acrostic for sight. And S stands for seize the moment. Right? Seize the moment. He was seeing, or didn't see, but he heard Jesus coming by. He knew he was there, and he had to seize the moment. He begins to cry out, Jesus of Nazareth, son of David, have mercy on me. He got up that morning having no idea that that very day Jesus Christ would walk by. He went to the same place, the same blanket he laid out before him, the same posture of asking for alms. He had no idea that day he would come by, but when Jesus starts coming by, it was his moment, and he had to seize it, and he begins calling out to God. Daily, you have opportunities to seize the moment for you, for your eyes to open, to see things differently, to make a change in your life. We have to learn to seize the moment when they pass us by. And here's blind Bartimaeus doing that very thing. We often struggle with that, don't we? We don't always seize them, but we don't always take advantage of opportunities. We have, manana syndrome, right? Not to be confused with Madonna syndrome, right? For you 80s people, right? Manana syndrome. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it later. We put it off, and yet you have to seize the moment. The Bible talks about the fact that life is short, right? Job 8:9, our life is short. We pass like shadows across the earth. Job 9:25, my days are swifter than a runner. They fly away. Life is short. Life's a shadow. Life is swift. James 4:14, how do you know what will happen tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here for a little while, then it's gone. We're not guaranteed tomorrow. We can't presume upon tomorrow. I've always liked the Message's paraphrase of Luke 9:62. Jesus said, no procrastination, no backward looks. You can't put God's kingdom off till tomorrow. Seize the day. Some of you need to do that. You've been procrastinating for a long time, putting off God's kingdom. God wants you to open your eyes and take a step and change, and you're not doing it. It's time to seize the moment. It's time to seize the opportunity. That's what he's doing here. He is shouting all the more. He's just shouting out. Verse 48, many rebuked him and told him to be quiet. That was their attitude, just shh. You're a nuisance. You're a beggar. They treated him like we treat people who are begging, don't they? And don't we? Just kind of ignore him. In fact, remember the disciples earlier, the kids were coming to Jesus? They go away, kids. Remember that? It was their job to do crowd control. They were his handlers. They're shooing the kids away. They're shooing the beggars away. And they're trying to quiet this man down. He was an outcast. He was a nuisance. And he was maybe the first time people ever paid attention to him. The Son of Honor didn't feel very honored. And first time he cries out and gets a lot of attention, they rebuke him and try to quiet him. But you gotta like this guy, though. It has no effect on him. He shouted all the more, right? Son of David, have mercy on me. He was blind, so he could not find his way to Jesus like other people who needed healing would do. Jesus had to find his way to him. He said, I can't find my way to Jesus. He's got to find his way to me. So I'm going to shout all the more so Jesus will hear me and come to me. Have mercy on me. He was persistent. And there's the eye in sight. And that's ignore the opposition, right? You got to seize the moment. You have to ignore the opposition. Shh, be quiet. He ignored all of that. All the external opposition, all the voices that were shouting. He's passionate. He's persistent. Boy, nobody's going to stop him from getting to Jesus. Many of us quit so soon. But he was persistent. He was ignoring all the opposition coming at him. Anytime you have a dream, anytime you have a goal, anytime you want to make a change in your life, there will be always people who will be there to criticize you and critique you. You're working too many hours, you cut back on your hours. Hey, why aren't you working more hours? You want to get involved in the community? Why are you going to that group? That's a big commitment to go to that group. You're trying to break free from some addictive behavior. Hey, why aren't you partying with us anymore? Trying to have integrity in your work and your work ethic. Why don't you engage those business practices anymore? Right? There's always people going to critique you. There's always voices that are going to try to tell you what they want you to do, but you have to only listen to God's voice only. And he wanted to see. I love Proverbs 29:25. Again, the Message paraphrase is really good. The fear of human opinion disables, but trusting in God protects you from that. Don't listen to what people are telling you. Only listen to what God wants you to do. And he felt he wanted to be healed. And he shouts all the more. But how does Jesus respond? Verse 49, it says, Jesus stopped and said, call him. Jesus stopped. The whole caravan comes to a screeching halt. They just stop in that moment. Some translations say, Jesus stood still. That's what it literally means. He stood still. I can imagine everyone getting a little quiet. And this man's still calling out. He's passionate. He's persistent. And it worked. And I'm always amazed that Jesus stopped. Because in about a week, he'll be dead. And he knows that. He's going to Jerusalem. He's going to the cross. He's carrying a heavy burden. His mind has to be preoccupied with that. He has to have a heavy heart. And yet in the midst of having a heavy heart and being preoccupied with his mission of saving the world, saving you and me, he stops for the one. He stops for the one. This has always been very convicting to me that he would actually do that. He hears one man's plea. And our tyranny of urgent things we must take place, that we must do, in our busy blindness, we don't see the one. And Jesus saw the one. Do you see the one? Do you stop for the one? Jesus, he just stops for this guy. And he calls out, have mercy on me. No prayer to Jesus is ever seen as an interruption to him. He will listen. He will stop for the one. And Jesus said, call him. Don't silence him. Call him. And they called the blind man, cheer up, on your feet. He's calling you. Right? They were telling him to be quiet. Now they're helping him out, right? The very ones who will discourage you, God might use to deliver you. That's what happens here. Verse 50, throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. The crowd represents external opposition, but the cloak represents more internal opposition. The cloak was a heavy outer garment made of wool they would put over them, and by day they would spread it out and beg for alms, and by night it would be a blanket to keep them warm. It would be a sleeping mat. That cloak represented his world, and yet he threw it aside, no encumbrances. He wanted nothing in the way to keep him from getting to Jesus. He throws aside, he jumps to his feet, and he comes to Jesus. There's no indication anybody helped him. Maybe it did, but there's no indication of that. But he worked his way to Jesus, even though he was blind. And he threw his safety, literally his security blanket, his security, his identity as a beggar, as a blind man who receives alms. He threw all that aside. His whole lifestyle, he threw it aside that he might come to Jesus. His self-sufficiency, his safety, his security. We're to throw off anything that hinders us from coming to Jesus. Like Hebrews 12:1 says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. This is a picture of the Greek games. The Greek games had come and they would run and they would take off their cloaks and they would literally run in the birthday suits. I kid you not. No encumbrances, right? Nothing to hinder you. That's kind of what Bartimaeus is doing. All he owned was that cloak, and that's where he collected all of his money, and he pushed all that aside to come to Jesus. He had to ignore all the opposition, all the barriers. And then he gets to Jesus, and what happens next? Jesus meets him at the point of his very need. In verse 51, Jesus asks him a question, what do you want me to do for you? Now, why would Jesus ask this question? It would seem obvious to me and to you as to what this guy would want. A surprising question. What do you desire? What do you want? But this question isn't so much about information. It's an invitation. Jesus would oftentimes ask people before he healed them what they wanted. He's asking this man the same thing. He wanted him to grapple with this idea of what he wanted. That's the next point here is that grapple with what I want. Seize the moment, ignore the opposition, and grapple with what I really want. You say, of course he wants to see. Well, that's not obvious. Often we hold on to our handicaps, we hold on to our hang-ups, hang on to our habits. One of the hard lessons I've learned over many years of doing ministry is most of us would rather complain than be cured. And I'm just guilty as that as you are. It's much easier to complain about my problems than to really deal with curing them. What do you really want? You need to figure that out. Do you really want to be healed? Do you really want to see? See, what he could have said is, I want monetary mercy. Set me up for life. Give me a bunch of money. and I can sit on the side of the road. Actually, I don't need to sit on the side of the road. I can buy my own house, and I can be set for the rest of my life. He could have asked for that. Could he have? Yes, he could have. Just a little bit of relief. Monetary mercy, a few shekels for a blind man, please. He could have asked for that, but he asked him, no, what do you really want? He gave him a chance to exercise his faith and see if he really believed in God or not. And how does Bartimaeus answer that question? It says in verse 51, the blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Rabboni was the intensified form here used for rabbi. It's the highest rabbi. It's the highest spiritual leader. My master, my Lord, he said, I want to see. That's what I want. I want to see. I don't just want some money. I don't just want a few shekels. I want full sight. I want to see. And the word there for see is the idea of seeing again, so it gives indication that maybe he'd been able to see when he was younger and he'd gone blind at some point through disease or injury, but he wants to recover his sight. I want to see. By the way, you might recognize that question last week when Pastor Keith was teaching back in Mark 10:36. Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you, right? It's the exact same question. And he asked that of James and John. Remember they said, we want to sit next to you, right, in your kingdom, right? Sit at your side in glory, they said. What do you want? Jesus says, we want glory. What do we want, Bartimaeus? I want mercy. Very different. We want thrones. Bartimaeus says, I just want to be able to see. We want success. I want sight. We want power. I want perception. But he'll ask you, what do you want? Same question, different intentions. Let me ask you today, how would you answer this question? What do you want me to do for you? Bartimaeus got up that morning. He had no idea that morning that he'd be asked that question that day. And maybe you got up this morning, you didn't know you'd be asked this question either. But I ask you, if Jesus Christ walked in here and stood right here and said, what do you want me to do for you? What would you say? I want glory. I want mercy. What would you ask him? I want relief. A few shekels. Or would you say, I want restoration, full sight? Think about the things you pray for. I was thinking this past week about how I pray often for relief. Comfort this and help give me strength for this and give me this. But I think God wants us to pray bigger prayers. Too often, we ask too little of Jesus. Don't just pray for relief, pray for restoration. God, may I see. God, may you heal the marriage. God, may my children follow you with all their hearts. God, may my neighbors love you. May they be introduced into your kingdom. We should think bigger prayers. What do you want? James 4:2 says, you want something, but you don't get it. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives. If God asks you what you want, you need to tell him what you want. Ask him for things. The reason we don't get things oftentimes, according to James, is we don't ask. When he asks you what you want, tell him what you want. God, I want this. I want to see. And make sure your motives are right, James says. Not just for glory. There has to be more to it than that. In this room, I know some of you are hurting. I know. You're carrying burdens in this room. Disappointments, losses, griefs, frustrations. What do you want? What do you want God to do with those things? Some of you feel like life is passing you by, like it passed by Bartimaeus. It's passing them by. It's time to seize the moment. Ignore opposition. It's time to grapple with what you want. Well, what happened? It says in Verse 52, Jesus said, "Go, your faith has healed you." Go, your faith has healed you. There's Jesus standing in front of Bartimaeus, standing in front of part of his broken creation. And he came to reverse the curse, and so he heals him. Go, he says, live your life. You've been healed. In the tense there has the idea of an ongoing permanent condition. And how that happened? Through faith. Your faith has healed you. You say, I don't have much faith, you might say today. Well, that's okay. Use the faith you got. You use the faith you have. It doesn't take a little faith. It doesn't take a lot of faith. Just a little faith in a big God produces big results. It's not the size of your faith. It's the size of your God. It's not the amount of your faith. It's the object of your faith. It's not the depth of your faith. It's the direction of your faith. He didn't have faith in faith. He had faith in God. Faith in Jesus, the Messiah. Have mercy on me. And so humbly receive God's grace is the H in the acrostic. Humbly receive God's grace. Seize the moment. Ignore the opposition. Grapple with what I want. Humbly receive God's grace. Grace is God doing for you what you cannot do for yourself. Bartimaeus could not heal himself. He could only humbly receive it. Grace is the divine hand that extends down to give healing. Faith is a human hand that extends up to receive healing. And so we receive grace by faith. So today you just believe, God, help me see. God, change this situation. And the word there for healed is the same word used for salvation. Of being saved spiritually. He was not just made physically well, he was made spiritually well. He received the very mercy of God, the very grace of God that's more than sufficient. You know, grace is not just to save you. You realize that. Grace is to sustain you. That just makes you right with Jesus, helps you follow Jesus. Grace is the very power of God in your life, and grace is always sufficient for what God is calling us to do. And so, you're facing some impossible situation. Say, God, I cannot do this, but I need your grace. And we receive his grace. John 1:16 says, from the fullness of his grace, we've all received one blessing after another. We receive grace. Today you say, God, give me your grace. Bartimaeus was blind, but he had enough vision to see one thing, that he had a need for God's grace. And secondly, that Jesus could meet that need. And he calls out to him, and you can do the same thing today. And when his eyes opened, the first thing he saw was Jesus, standing right there before him. And it says in the last part of verse 52, and he followed Jesus along the road. His eyes opened, he followed Jesus along the road. The evidence that he truly was healed spiritually and not just physically was he followed Jesus. Not just forgiving grace, but following grace. That's how you know that someone really is a believer. They follow Jesus. And he began following him. And that's the last letter, and that's take the next step. Take the next step. Tradition tells us that he followed Jesus down the road. And this is the term there for follow is Mark's favorite term for discipleship. He became a follower of Jesus. He follows him down the road. He goes, he's there at the cross. He's there at the resurrection. He's there in the upper room when the Holy Spirit comes and church is born. He becomes a leader in the church, and he followed Jesus. He took his next step. Some people get things from God and they just go on with their lives, but there needs to be gospel gratitude. And gospel gratitude means whenever God does something for us, we have a sense of gratitude about us and a sense of loyalty to God for it. I don't know what your next step is, but here's what I know. You need to take one. I know that. Everyone listening, whether you're watching online or you're in this house, you need to take your next step, whatever that is. For some of you, it is becoming a believer in Jesus. For some of you, it's getting baptized. We're going to do baptism few weeks, it's time for you to get baptized. You've never done that since you've been a believer in Jesus. For some of you, it's going to Discover Life Church or join this church or going to a group or serving, tithing, a mission trip, something about your mental health, some addiction. I don't know what your next step is, but I know this: when you stop taking steps, you stop growing. Today, the call is to take your next step in following Jesus. We believe in next steps so much at our church, we have a section on our website called Next Steps. On your app, at the bottom of your app, it says Next Steps, right? If you're not sure your next step is, go open your app up and find some next steps. Because you have to be following Jesus. Faith is action. As James 2:14 says, brothers and sisters, if people say they have faith but do nothing, their faith is worth nothing. Faith is free, but it changes and transforms and results in action. And so, take your next step. The very first verse in verse 46 says Bartimaeus was sitting by the roadside. The very last verse, verse 52, says immediately he followed Jesus along the road. He's by the road, or literally by the way, begging in the beginning. Now he's following Jesus on the way as a disciple. Some of you are out of the game. You're sidelined. You're on the side of the road and you're begging. You may not even know you're begging, but your life feels insufficient. Your life feels empty. It feels unfulfilled. Something's not right. It's probably because you're on the side of the road and you're empty. And the call today is to have sight and see Jesus and follow him. Don't be by the way, but be on the way. The way were the followers of Jesus in the early church. They were called the people of the way. Follow Jesus along the way as he is calling you. Which most describes my life, sitting by the road or following Jesus on the road? It's a great question for you to ask yourself. Today, is your posture of your life sitting by the road, sidelined, or is your posture following him on the road, taking your next step? Which is most fulfilling? Which gives more joy? Which is most satisfying? Which, by the way, do you want to be representative of your life? So have sight. Have sight. Seize the moment. Ignore the opposition. Grapple with what I want. Humbly receive God's grace and take the next step today. Whatever God's calling you to do that. You know, Bartimaeus could not see, but he could hear. And he heard enough to believe, and then he saw. I think of the words of Job in Job 42:5. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. That's what happened to Bartimaeus. He had heard, but now he was seeing. You know, we're a lot like Bartimaeus, you know that. He had never seen Jesus, he only heard of him. Anybody here ever seen Jesus with your eyes? No, but you've heard of him. We're just like Bartimaeus. We've only heard, we've never seen. 1 Peter 1:8, though you have not seen him, you love him. Even though you have not seen him now, you believe in him. That's what we're like. But as we believe in what we hear about Jesus, I promise you, like Bartimaeus, one day you will see him. You will see him. We bow your heads. We have a prayer and care room here in the back. As we sing one last song, you can go back there during this last song. We'd love to pray with you about any needs you have. We also have people who can talk to you about being a believer in Jesus. If you're not sure what it means to really follow Jesus and take your next step, love to go back to the prayer room and talk to someone. Feel free to do that during the song or after the service. As all your eyes are closed, you're just like Bartimaeus, aren't you? You can't see. All of us in this very moment are blind. We're all Bartimaeus, all in need of mercy. All of us coming today with empty hands, in need of grace. Sitting beside the road, asking Jesus to have mercy on us. I want you to imagine with your eyes closed, you're sitting by that road and you're blind, but you hear Jesus say, "What do you want?" What do you tell him this day? What do you want? Search your heart and ask yourself, what do you want? Do you just want relief? Do you want restoration? I thank God that Jesus stopped that day, and I want to remind all of us today that he still stops. And he'll stop today if you call out to him for mercy. Call on his name. Father, we pray today that we would be like Bartimaeus, even though we have never seen you, we've heard about you. We'll believe in what we've heard. God, I pray today you'd help us seize the moment, ignore opposition, grapple with what we want, humbly receive the grace you give us, and take the next step in following you. A lot of applications there, Father. May your Spirit apply them to our hearts that we might see. Cheer up, they said. He's calling you. Today I tell you, he's calling you. May we say yes to Jesus and follow him along the road. In Christ's name I pray, amen. John 9:25, one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. That can be you. Let's worship God today.